All right, let's jump in our time machine and head back about 400 years. We're going to build one of history's most important musical inventions from scratch, the Baroque Orchestra. So, let's dive in and see how this 17th century musical powerhouse was really put together.
So when I say supergroup, you're probably picturing rock stars, right? But what did a musical supergroup look and, more importantly, sound like back in the 1600s? Well, the answer is the Baroque Orchestra. And trust me, it was a totally revolutionary idea for its time.
Yeah, you gotta forget what you know about these huge modern orchestras with 100 musicians. Back then, it was all about being smaller, more elite. These were the first professional orchestras, ever. Wealthy nobles would hire these permanent groups of expert musicians to perform right there in their palaces. Pretty cool, huh?
So here's the plan. We're going to build one of these orchestras from the ground up. First, we'll meet the team. Then we'll lay the foundation with the strings and something called the continuo. After that, we'll add some color with woodwinds, bring in the real power-ups with brass and percussion, and then take a look at the big picture of how they all played together. And finally, we'll see why it all still matters today.
So what was the big deal? What made this new type of orchestra so special? Well, it was the whole idea of a permanent team. For the first time, composers could write music for a specific, reliable group of instruments, and they knew exactly how it was going to sound. This was a complete game changer.
And when I say these orchestras were small, I mean small. We're talking typically just 10 to 40 players. You know, the final number really just depended on how deep the nobles' pockets were, and of course the size of the room they were playing in.
All right, time to grab our hard hats. Let's start building this thing. Every great structure needs a rock-solid foundation. And for the Baroque Orchestra, that foundation was all about two key parts, the string family and a really special section called the basso continuo.
The strings were, without a doubt, the heart and soul of the orchestra. They really dominated the sound. So you had the violins, right up top, carrying the main tune. The violas were in the middle, filling out all the harmony. And then you had the cellos and the double basses holding down the low end with those deep, rich notes.
And get this is a wild little fact. Their strings weren't made of steel like they are today. Nope, they were made from gut. Yes, as in animal intestines. It sounds a little weird, but it gave the instruments this really warm, kind of delicate sound that was just perfect for playing in those palace rooms.
Okay, now for this weird-sounding term, basso continuo. What even is that? Well, think of it as the orchestra's engine room. It wasn't just one instrument, but a pair working together. Usually a harpsichord playing the chords and a cello playing the bass line. They were the rhythmic and harmonic backbone of everything. Honestly, the easiest way to think about it is in modern band terms. The continuo was basically the rhythm section. It was like the bass guitar and the drums all rolled into one, laying down a solid groove that everyone else could build on top of. Without it, the whole thing would just fall apart.
And the star of the continuo was usually the harpsichord. Now, this instrument is really cool. See, a piano hits its strings with a little hammer, but a harpsichord plucks them with a tiny quill. This created this bright, almost shimmering sound, but it also meant you couldn't really play softer or louder just by how hard you press the keys.
Okay, our foundation is solid. Now it's time to get creative and add some color to our sound. And that's exactly where the woodwind instruments came in. They added all these new textures and tones that were totally different from the strings.
So the many woodwinds you'd hear were recorders and wooden flutes, which gave you those light, airy melodies. Then you had oboes, which had this kind of piercing, reedy sound that could cut right through the entire orchestra. And holding down the low end for the woodwinds were the bassoons.
But here's what's just amazing about these musicians. Baroque woodwinds had hardly any keys compared to the ones you see today. To play all the right notes, players needed these ridiculously complex and fast fingerings. It took an incredible amount of skill.
All right, our orchestra is sounding pretty full, right? But what if we need to get loud, for those big, epic, dramatic moments? Well, it's time to bring in the special effects department, the brass and the percussion.
Yeah, these guys were the heavy hitters, and they were usually saved for special occasions. Trumpets were all about royalty and big announcements, fanfares. Horns often showed up in music that was supposed to sound like a hunting scene. And really, the only percussion you'd hear were the timpani, the big kettle drums that added all that thunderous power.
Now you have to hear this. Baroque trumpets had no valves. I mean, 0 buttons, nothing. Players had to change every single note just by changing the way they buzzed their lips. It was unbelievably difficult. You had to be a world-class musician to play one of those things well.
We did it! We've assembled our supergroup.
So, how did this whole thing actually work when they played together? Because let me tell you, the way they performed was very, very different from what you'd see in a concert hall today.
Okay, first thing you'd notice, there's no conductor. You know, that person standing up front waving a little stick? Nope, didn't exist. Instead, the orchestra was led from the inside. The lead violinist might direct everybody with their bow, or the harpsichord player would lead with head nods. Sometimes they'd even stomp a big wooden staff on the floor to keep the beat, which, yeah, the audience could definitely hear.
Another really key feature was something with a fancy name, terraced dynamics. Now, dynamics is just a word for the volume of the music. But in the Baroque era, they didn't do those slow, gradual build-ups from soft to loud. Instead, the music would just jump, instantly, from quiet to loud.
So how'd they pull that off? It was actually brilliantly simple. For a soft section, maybe you'd only have a few instruments playing. And then, bam! For a loud section, the entire orchestra would suddenly jump in all at once. This created this really dramatic, block-like contrast that is a total hallmark of the Baroque sound.
So, we've built our orchestra, we've heard how it played, but why should we care? Why does this group from 400 years ago still matter so much? Well, its legacy is, and this is no exaggeration, the foundation of pretty much all Western classical music.
I mean, when you really think about it, the Baroque Orchestra gave us the blueprint for everything we have today. It gave us the whole idea of a professional orchestra. It taught composers how to blend different instrument colors together. It laid the foundation for modern harmony. Seriously, every single symphony orchestra that exists today owes its existence to this original 17th century supergroup.
Every single instrument we've talked about, from those warm, gut-stringed violins to the unbelievably tricky valveless trumpets, played a crucial role. So after seeing how this 17th century supergroup was put together, I gotta ask you, which instrument would you have wanted to play?